Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'm settling in while we go through some of the most gut-wrenching, jaw-dropping relationship betrayal stories that Reddit has to offer. The kind of stories that make you put your phone down for a second and genuinely reconsider who you have in your life. These are the people who were supposed to be your person, your partner, your best friend, your ride or die, and they chose to be something else entirely. Before we get into it, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because I put out new compilations every week and you genuinely do not want to miss what's coming. Also drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing where the algorithm sends these videos. It fascinates me every time. Anyway, grab your favorite blanket, get comfortable, and let's get into some stories about the people who were supposed to be in your corner and decided to burn it down instead. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that the two people they trusted most in the world had been lying to their face for the better part of a year, and decided to wait for exactly the right moment to make sure everyone found out at once. I was with my girlfriend Natalie for 4 years. We met in college, moved in together after graduation, and by the time we hit year 3, I was pretty sure she was the person I was going to spend my life with. She was warm, funny, and always seemed like the most loyal person in any room. That was actually one of the things I loved about her. She had this fierce, almost stubborn loyalty to the people she cared about. Or so I thought. My best friend since middle school is a guy named Derek. We'd been close for almost 15 years at that point. He was in my corner for everything. The rough years after my parents' divorce, the job I got fired from at 23, the apartment I couldn't afford, and he helped me float for 2 months without making it weird. Derek was the definition of someone you trust with your life. He was also the first person I introduced Natalie to when we started dating, and the three of us became this inseparable little unit. Group dinners, weekend trips, mutual friends who just assumed we'd all grow old together. The first sign that something was wrong was so small I almost didn't register it. About 11 months ago, Natalie and I were lying in bed on a Sunday morning, and she got a text. She picked up her phone, and the way she angled the screen away from me lasted maybe half a second. So fast, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But I didn't imagine it. I know her. And that little movement wasn't how she normally handled her phone around me. I didn't say anything. I tucked it away and kept watching. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern. Natalie had always been a pretty casual phone user around me. She'd scroll through things openly, show me memes, leave her phone face up on the counter. That started changing. Not dramatically. Just enough that if you weren't paying attention, you wouldn't notice. The phone was suddenly always face down. She'd step into the bathroom to respond to certain texts. She started going to bed a little later than me, which had never been her habit. Around the same time, Derek started being slightly less available. He'd cancel plans with vague excuses. He'd respond to my texts on a delay, when he'd always been someone who replied immediately. Once, I called him on a Thursday night, and he didn't pick up, then texted me back 40 minutes later saying he'd fallen asleep early. When I mentioned to Natalie that I tried to reach Derek, she said, "Oh, he mentioned he's been really tired lately." And something about the ease of that answer, the fact that she had a ready explanation, landed wrong. I still didn't say anything. I started keeping notes. I want to be clear that at this point, I had no proof of anything. I had a feeling, a bad one, and I'd learned enough from watching other people blow up their relationships on suspicion alone to know that I wasn't going to make a move until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. So for the next 2 months, I quietly collected information. I checked our shared location app, which Natalie and I had set up years ago when we did long distance for a summer and never turned off. She was at a coffee shop one Tuesday afternoon she hadn't mentioned going to. That alone was nothing, but Derek had texted me that same Tuesday saying he was swamped with work from home. The coffee shop was 4 blocks from his apartment. I started paying attention to when both of them were quiet at the same time. There were stretches, Wednesday evenings, occasional Sunday afternoons, where neither of them was responding to anything, and then both would resurface within 20 minutes of each other, with completely separate explanations for where they'd been. The thing that actually confirmed it was something neither of them planned. About 3 months into my quiet surveillance, Derek and I were at a bar with a group of friends, and he got a notification on his watch. It was just a preview, just enough text visible for half a second before he dismissed it. I didn't see the content. I saw the name. The contact name in his phone for the sender was a string of emojis, the kind you set for someone you don't want identified if anyone glances at your screen. Nobody does that for a contact. They have nothing to hide about. I went home that night, and I told Natalie I'd had a great time. I kissed her and went to sleep, and lay there in the dark, thinking about what I was going to do. Here's what I decided. Natalie and I had been talking about getting engaged. Her family knew it was coming. My family knew it was coming. There was a dinner already planned at her parents' house the following month. A birthday dinner for her mother that had quietly become the assumed occasion where I'd propose. Natalie's mom had even made a comment about it to me directly, squeezing my hand and saying she was so happy. Natalie had found someone she could count on. I decided I was going to that dinner. I was not going to propose. And I was going to make absolutely sure that when everything came out, it came out in front of every single person who mattered to both of them at the same time. Derek was also invited to that dinner. He came to everything. He was family. Over the next few weeks, I got my evidence in order. I hired someone to do a basic social media sweep and background check. I know that sounds dramatic, but it cost me $200 and confirmed what I already suspected. There were followed accounts and interactions between Natalie and Derek's private profiles that didn't line up with two people who only saw each other through me. Timestamps on likes and comments that placed them in the same locations at the same times on days I wasn't present. I also reached out to a friend of Natalie's named Priya, who had been slightly distant with me for the past few months in a way that now made sense. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just told her I'd noticed some things and asked her to be honest with me. Priya was quiet for a long time and then said, "I told her this would come out. I told her." She confirmed what I already knew. She said it had started about 10 months ago, shortly after a weekend trip Natalie and Derek had both attended without me, because I had a work conflict. She said she had begged Natalie to end it and come clean, and Natalie had said she was going to figure it out. The dinner was on a Saturday. Natalie spent the afternoon getting ready, excited and happy, in a way that made my stomach hurt, because I knew what she was expecting the night to be. Derek showed up with flowers for her mother. He hugged me at the door. We sat down to dinner. Natalie's parents, her aunt and uncle, her older brother, his wife, Derek, Natalie, and me, after the main course. Natalie's mom made a little speech about the people around her table and how grateful she was for all of them. She looked at me pointedly at the end of it. Everyone laughed. The moment was arriving, and everyone in that room could feel it. I stood up. I had a glass in my hand. I thanked everyone for being there and said I had something to say. I said that I had spent the last 4 years believing I'd found the person I was meant to build a life with, and that for most of that time, I'd also believed I had a best friend I could trust, with everything I valued. I said that over the past several months, I'd discovered that I was wrong about both, and that I thought the people in this room deserved to know the truth before anyone made any decisions about the future. Then I put my phone on the table, pulled up the documentation I'd compiled, and walked through it calmly. The location overlaps, the private account interactions, what Priya had confirmed, the timeline going back 10 months. Natalie started crying before I got to the second item. Derek turned a color I don't have a word for. Her father pushed back from the table. Her brother said something I'm not going to repeat. Derek tried to start a sentence twice and couldn't finish it either time. Natalie said she was sorry, that it had just happened, that she didn't know how to tell me. Her mother was completely silent, which from what I know of, that woman was the most devastating possible response. I put the ring box on the table. I'd bought it 3 months earlier, before I knew anything. And I'd kept it because I wanted it there. And I said I wouldn't be needing it. Then I thanked everyone for dinner, said goodbye to Natalie's parents specifically, and left. Neither Natalie nor Derek has been part of my life since that night. I've heard through mutual friends that the relationship between Natalie's family and Derek became something that couldn't be repaired. I've also heard that whatever Natalie and Derek had between them didn't survive the exposure either, which honestly surprised me less than it probably should have. I moved out of our apartment 2 weeks later. I have a place of my own now. It's quieter than I expected, and most of the time that's fine. That story is absolutely devastating in the most quietly powerful way. What makes it so remarkable isn't the confrontation itself, it's the patience. This is someone who had every reason to blow everything up the moment they suspected what was happening. And instead, they spent months doing the thing that's hardest to do when you're in that kind of pain, which is nothing. Waiting, watching, building. The ring box on the table is the detail that stays with you, because he'd carried it for 3 months already knowing he wasn't going to use it. There's something deeply satisfying about watching two people who thought they were being careful get completely dismantled by the one person they underestimated. They assumed he wasn't paying attention. That was their only mistake, and it was more than enough. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who betrayed you is simply make sure the truth comes out in a room full of every person whose opinion they value most. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the woman they'd been building a future with had been running a second life so complete and carefully maintained that exposing it required becoming a completely different kind of person than they were used to being. I met Simone at a work conference 3.5 years ago. She was sharp, composed, the kind of person who commanded a room without seeming to try. We were in the same industry, logistics management, and we started talking during a panel session and didn't stop for the rest of the weekend. By the time we flew home to separate cities, we'd already agreed to make the distance work. For the first year, we did long distance between Chicago and Nashville. I flew to her, she flew to me, and every visit felt like confirmation that this was worth the inconvenience. We talked on the phone every night. She knew everything about my life, and I thought I knew everything about hers. She had a close group of friends from college, a sister she was tight with, a demanding job that she was clearly excellent at. She seemed whole and known and real. I relocated to Nashville 14 months into the relationship. She helped me find an apartment 5 minutes from hers. We weren't ready to move in together yet, she said, and I respected that. I rebuilt my professional network from scratch in a new city because I believed we were heading somewhere permanent. The first indication that something wasn't right came about 6 months after I moved. And like most first indications, it was almost nothing. Simone and I had plans on a Thursday evening, dinner at a restaurant we'd been meaning to try. She texted me at 4 in the afternoon saying she had to reschedule, work emergency. She was so sorry. That happened occasionally, and I thought nothing of it. But I drove past that restaurant at 7:30 that night, on my way back from a friend's place, and Simone's car was in the lot. I sat in traffic for a moment and told myself there was an explanation. Maybe she'd been able to get away from work. Maybe she'd gone alone or with a colleague. I didn't call her. I went home and she texted me around 9 to say the work crisis had finally resolved, and she was exhausted and heading to bed. I said goodnight. I drove past that restaurant 2 more times over the next week, at different hours. Out of a habit, I didn't fully acknowledge I was forming, and her car wasn't there again. I nearly convinced myself I'd been mistaken about what I'd seen. What I wasn't mistaken about was the name I saw on her laptop screen about a month later when she left it open on her kitchen counter, and I walked past it on my way to make coffee. The screen had an email client open, and the name in the conversation thread didn't belong to anyone she'd ever mentioned to me. The email preview was brief, but the subject line and the sign-off, "Miss you already," were enough to make me set my coffee mug down very carefully and go sit in another room. Simone came back into the kitchen a few minutes later and closed the laptop without noticing where I'd been standing. We had a normal Saturday morning. I was completely normal. I had gotten very good at that. I spent the next week doing something I never thought I'd do, which was quietly investigating the person I loved. I want to say upfront that it didn't feel righteous or satisfying in the moment. It felt awful. Every piece of information I turned over made me wish I'd found nothing, and I kept finding something. The name from the email was Marcus. A basic search connected him to Nashville. He worked in real estate, had a visible professional profile, was around our age. Nothing in his public presence indicated any connection to Simone. But when I looked at the timing and geography of certain things, a weekend Simone had told me she was visiting her sister in Memphis, a Thursday evening she'd said was a work dinner. I started understanding that I wasn't looking at something casual. The restaurant I'd spotted her car at was 4 blocks from Marcus's office address, and I reached out to Simone's college friend Dana, who I'd met a handful of times. I didn't accuse. I just said I'd noticed Simone seemed stressed lately, and I was trying to understand if something was going on that she hadn't told me about. Donna's response was a very long pause, followed by, "How much do you know?" That told me everything about how long this had been going on and how many people around me already knew. According to Dana, Marcus wasn't new. He and Simone had been together on and off for nearly 2 years, predating my relocation to Nashville and overlapping with most of my time in the city. He believed they were in a relationship. I believed the same thing. Simone had apparently constructed 2 entirely parallel versions of her life, and maintained both of them with a level of discipline that I found genuinely difficult to comprehend once I started mapping it out. Donna said she had told Simone multiple times to end one or the other. Simone kept saying she was going to handle it. I took a few days to sit with what I knew and decide how I wanted to respond. The easy thing, maybe the expected thing, would have been to confront her directly. Tell her what I knew, demand an explanation, let the conversation collapse into whatever it was going to collapse into. I considered that. I also considered that Simone was someone who was exceptionally good at managing conversations, redirecting them, finding the angle that made her the reasonable one. I'd watched her do it professionally and socially, and I knew that walking into a confrontation with only what I had might give her room to minimize, reframe, or turn it around. So I waited a little longer, and I made sure I had something she couldn't redirect. Simone had mentioned early in our relationship that she dreamed of eventually buying a house. It had been a recurring topic between us. What neighborhood, what kind of layout, what kind of life we were picturing inside it. About 2 months before I found out about Marcus, she'd started talking about it more concretely. She'd mentioned a specific street in East Nashville she loved. She'd asked me once, almost offhandedly, if I could see myself being ready to buy within the next year. I said yes, because I meant it. What Simone had not told me was that she had already begun that process with Marcus. Dana confirmed this. They had been going to open houses together for 6 weeks. He was under the impression they were planning a future. She was letting him believe that while also letting me believe the same thing. I am someone who communicates in writing when I need to be precise, which is probably why I work in logistics. I wrote Simone a letter, not an email, a physical letter. I laid out everything I knew in the order I'd learned it, with enough specific detail that there was no version of events where she could claim I was mistaken or overreacting. I referenced Donna by name. I referenced Marcus by name. I included the dates and the geography. Now, I told her that I had relocated my entire professional life to a city I had no previous connection to, based on a relationship that apparently existed alongside another one, and that I needed her to understand. I was aware of the full picture before either of us said another word. I mailed it to her office, not her home. Her office, where she would open it alone, with no ability to immediately manage my reaction or control the environment. She called me 4 hours after I estimated it would arrive. I didn't pick up. She called 6 more times that afternoon. She texted in between each call. First explanations, then apologies, then something that looked like bargaining, then a longer message that was genuinely remorseful, in a way that I'm sure was real, but that didn't change anything that had happened. I texted back once. I told her I didn't need a conversation. I told her I hoped she figured out what she actually wanted before doing this to the next person. Then I asked her to please be honest with Marcus about what had been going on, because he deserved to know. She responded that she would. I have no way of knowing if that's true. I moved back to Chicago 7 weeks later. I had to rebuild a professional network in a city I'd already left once, which was humbling in ways I'm still processing. I'm back now, and most days it feels like a manageable loss. But I spent 14 months rebuilding my life around someone who was treating it like a parallel option, and some part of me is still just genuinely staggered by the architecture of that kind of deception. The sustained effort it takes to maintain 2 complete versions of yourself for 2 complete separate people over years. I find it hard to understand, and I've stopped trying. That story is over. The detail that stays with you is that she was already going to open houses with the other man while simultaneously having conversations about buying a house together with this one. That's not a mistake or a moment of weakness. That's someone who built 2 entire futures in their head and kept both of them running like separate projects. The letter to the office is exactly the right move, because it removes every variable she would have used to control the conversation if they'd been in the same room. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone who is exceptional at managing other people's perceptions get handed a situation they can't manage, and watching her call 9 times to a phone that wasn't going to pick up is that moment. Sometimes the most powerful response to someone who runs on control is to simply take the conversation out of their hands entirely. Our next story comes from someone who spent 3 years believing they were in a committed partnership, only to discover that the person they were building a life with had been telling everyone in their hometown a completely different story about who they were and what their relationship meant. I'm going to call my ex-partner Eli, because that's close enough to his name, that I remember how it felt to say it, and different enough that I can tell this story without feeling like I'm handing him anything. We were together for 3 years and 2 months. I know the exact number because I counted it when it ended. The way you count something when you're trying to understand how much of your life went somewhere. Eli and I met through mutual friends in the city we both lived in at the time, Portland, Oregon. He was originally from a small town in rural Georgia, and he'd moved to Portland in his mid-20s, he said, because he wanted a different kind of life. I understood that to mean something specific, and he let me understand it that way. In the beginning, he was warm and attentive and completely present. He was the kind of person who remembered small things you said weeks after you said them, and brought them back in ways that made you feel genuinely seen. We moved in together after 8 months, a 2-bedroom apartment near the waterfront that we furnished slowly and carefully over time, piece by piece, the way you do when you're planning to stay somewhere. We had routines and inside jokes, and a full shared life. His friends were my friends. My family liked him immediately. The thing about Eli was that he talked about his hometown infrequently and vaguely. He had a sister he texted sometimes, and parents he called on holidays. But he never proposed a visit and always had a ready reason when the topic came up. By after a year, I stopped bringing it up because I could feel it was a pressure point. and I respected that some people's families are complicated. What I did not know, what I had no framework to suspect, was that Eli had a girlfriend back home. Her name was Renee. They had been together since they were 19 years old. She believed they were in a long-distance relationship that was eventually going to close the distance. His family knew about her and believed the same thing. He had apparently been going home for visits. The trips, he told me, were just solo family time, a few days here and there, and spending them with her, as her boyfriend, in the town where everyone knew them as a couple. I found out the way you find out things you were never supposed to know, which is by accident at the worst possible time, and Eli's sister came to visit Portland. I was thrilled about this. It was the first time any of his family had come to us, and I read it as a step towards something more open and integrated. We picked her up from the airport together. Her name was Maya, and she was lovely, genuinely lovely, and she was visibly confused the moment she looked at us standing together. She covered it. I could tell she was covering it. Something behind her eyes recalibrated fast, and she hugged her brother and smiled at me and said she'd heard so much about me. But over dinner that first night, in the gaps between stories and in the moments where she thought I wasn't watching, I could see her working something out. The way she looked at Eli sometimes was the look of someone doing math they didn't expect to have to do. When the next morning, Eli had a work call, and Maya and I went to get coffee down the street. I don't know exactly what Maya had decided overnight. I think she'd been living with this information for some time and had made her own private peace with staying out of it. And then she sat across the table from me and looked at my face and changed her mind. She asked me how long Eli and I had been together. I told her 3 years. She asked if I knew about Renee. I did not. She put her coffee cup down and she told me everything she knew, which was considerable, and then she said she was sorry, and that she should have said something sooner, and that she hadn't known how. I excused myself to use the restroom, and I stood in the bathroom of that coffee shop for a very long time. When Eli came home from his work call that afternoon, Maya was packed and had changed her flight. She left us alone. I want to say something to anyone who might ever be Maya in this situation. She did the right thing. It cost her something. She did it anyway. The conversation with Eli lasted 4 hours, and I can't give you all of it. But the shape of it was this. He had started the relationship with Renee before he moved to Portland, intended to end it when he got there, then didn't because it felt complicated, and then kept not ending it because the complication grew, and then was simply continuing it in parallel because he didn't know how to stop without detonating 2 lives at once. He said he loved me. He said he loved her too. He said he'd been trying to figure out what to do for 2 years. He cried. I believe all of it was true, and I also believe none of it was an explanation, and he wanted to know what I wanted him to do. I told him I wasn't the person who should be answering that question, and that Renee deserved to know what she was actually in. He said he would tell her. I asked him to tell her before the end of the week. Then I called my best friend and asked her to come get me, and I left his own apartment for 4 days. He did tell Renee. I know this because she found me on social media about 3 weeks later and sent me a message. She was not angry at me. She somehow understood immediately that I was as blindsided as she was, and she said so. We exchanged maybe a dozen messages. She was kind and clear-eyed in a way that I found both devastating and quietly remarkable. She said she'd known something was off for a long time and hadn't been willing to look at it directly, and that some part of her was almost relieved to finally understand what she'd been feeling. Eli moved out over the course of 2 weeks. He went back to Georgia. I don't know what he and Renee decided, and I stopped trying to find out. What I know is that I grieved the apartment more than I expected to. We had built it so carefully, picked each thing deliberately, and it took me a long time to stop seeing his choices in it. Eventually, I rearranged almost everything. It helped more than I expected. which is something no one tells you. That sometimes recovery from a betrayal is partly just physical, just about changing where the furniture is and which drawer the mugs are in, and whether the bookshelf is on the left or right wall. That story is over. The detail that cuts the deepest is that Renee knew something was wrong and had been choosing not to look at it directly. That's the thing nobody talks about honestly enough. Sometimes we already know, and we make the decision to keep not knowing because the knowing is too expensive right now. Maya's choice to speak up at that table is the moral center of this whole story. She blew up her family's comfortable arrangement with the truth, and she did it because she sat across from a person who deserved to know it. The fact that both women ended up finding each other and treating each other with kindness afterward says everything about who they are and nothing generous about who he was. Sometimes the people a betrayal connects become more meaningful to each other than the person who caused it. Our next story comes from someone who believed they had found genuine security after years of difficult relationships, only to discover that the stability they thought they'd finally built was resting on a foundation the other person had been quietly excavating for months. My name is not important, but what's important is that I was 37 when I married Claire, which meant I had spent a very long time before that learning what I didn't want. Previous relationships that ended badly had taught me to look for steadiness above everything else, not fireworks, not grand gestures, just someone who showed up the same way every day and meant what they said. Claire was that person, or she performed it so completely for so long that I never found the seam. We met at 34, through a friend of a friend at a dinner party, where neither of us had particularly wanted to be. She was a middle school art teacher. She had paint under her fingernails and strong opinions about coffee, and she laughed at something I said early in the evening in a way that felt completely unperformed. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. I did not rush it. I had learned not to rush things, and Claire respected that pace and never pushed. That patience itself felt like evidence of something trustworthy. We got married on a Saturday in October. Small wedding, 40 people, a venue outside the city. Simple food and good wine, and everyone we actually cared about in one room. My older brother gave a toast that made half the room cry. Claire's mother danced until midnight. I remember standing against the wall at one point, just watching the room and thinking, quietly and with a certainty I had not felt in years, that I had gotten something important right. We bought a house the following spring, a craftsman bungalow, in a neighborhood we both loved, the kind of house that needs work, but has good bones, which we both said was a metaphor we could get behind. We spent weekends on projects. We had a system. She had opinions about aesthetics. I had patience for the mechanical parts. And together, we could accomplish things that would have defeated either of us alone. The house became something we were genuinely proud of. The first sign was financial, which is not the kind of sign that registers as romantic betrayal. Until later when you're mapping the whole picture backward, when about 14 months into the marriage. I noticed that a savings account we maintained jointly, an emergency fund we'd built together, over 2 years of disciplined contributions, had a balance lower than it should have been. Not dramatically lower. Just enough lower that I noticed when I was paying attention to something else. I asked Claire about it, and she said she'd moved some money around to cover a shortfall on a credit card she'd forgotten to pay. She was apologetic and specific about the amount and the reason, and I had no reason to doubt her. 3 months later, the balance was lower again, different amount. When I asked, she said she'd covered a car repair she hadn't wanted to bother me with. Again, specific. Again, apologetic. Again, I had no reason to doubt her except that twice was now a pattern. See, and patterns were something I'd learned to pay attention to. I pulled the full account history and sat with it for an afternoon. The withdrawals went back further than I'd realized. Not the one she'd told me about, not the one after that, but a series of smaller movements going back 8 months that individually would have looked like nothing but collectively added up to almost $11,000, pulled from an account she knew I checked in frequently. Amounts just under the threshold that would have triggered any automatic notification. Time for periods when I was traveling for work or particularly busy. This was not carelessness. This was calibrated. I did not confront her immediately. I called my brother, who is an attorney, and asked him some general questions about financial accounts and a marriage in our state. And then I contacted a financial advisor I trusted independently and asked some more questions. Then I took 2 weeks to go through every shared account we had, every credit card, every subscription, every statement, and I built a complete picture of where our money actually was versus where I believed it to be. The gap was larger than I'd found in the savings account. Claire had a credit card in her name alone, which was fine, people have separate cards. But the balance on it was $42,000, and the purchase history I was able to access through a statement that arrived in paper form, which she'd failed to intercept before I got the mail, showed a pattern of spending that did not correspond to any version of our life that I recognized. Hotels and cities she'd told me she hadn't visited, and restaurants on evenings I knew she'd said she was doing something else. 2 airline tickets, one of which could have been hers, one of which could not have been. I sat at our kitchen table in the house we had built together, and I understood that I was not just looking at a financial problem. I contacted a private investigator. I want to be honest that this felt extreme to me, and I thought carefully before doing it. I did it because I had already learned that Claire was capable of specific, sustained deception, and I knew that without independent documentation, I would be walking into a conversation where her version of events might be constructed to make me doubt my own. The investigator worked for 3 weeks. What he returned was thorough and clear. He knew Claire had been in a relationship with a man named Graham for approximately 8 months. Graham lived 40 minutes away, in a suburb of the city, and was separated from his own wife. Though according to the investigator, his wife was not aware the separation was the precursor to a specific other relationship. The hotel stays, the restaurants, the flights. One of those tickets had been to a long weekend in Montreal that Claire had told me was a girls' trip with colleagues from work. The $11,000 from the savings account, the $42,000 on the credit card. I am a methodical person, so I wrote down the total and looked at it for a while. I retained my brother. I want to be very clear about the sequence here because the sequence mattered. I retained my brother first. I gathered every piece of financial documentation I could access and had it copied and stored outside the house. I had a preliminary consultation about what a divorce filing in our state would look like, given the financial misconduct. I made sure I understood exactly where I stood legally before I changed anything about my behavior at home. Then I continued being normal for 2 more weeks. This is the part people find hardest to understand, and I understand why. But I'd been blindsided once by her initial presentation of who she was, and I was not going to be blindsided again by acting before I was fully prepared. Every day of those 2 weeks, I came home and cooked dinner and asked about her day and watched television on the couch, next to a person I no longer recognized, and said goodnight and meant none of it. And it was the strangest and loneliest experience of my life, and I would do it the same way again, because it worked. I filed on a Tuesday morning while Claire was at school. My brother had prepared everything. The filing included documentation of the financial misconduct, which under our state's laws was relevant to the division of assets. By the time Claire came home from work that evening, she had been served. I was not there when she was served. I had gone to stay with my brother and his wife, who had a guest room ready. I had taken with me everything that was specifically mine, everything that was jointly important to document, and the dog, who was named Howard and who I was not prepared to negotiate about. Claire called 15 times that evening. She texted in a register that moved through every stage: disbelief, anger, my explanation, apology, with a speed that suggested she had been anticipating this possibility and had some version of these responses already prepared. I read all of it. I did not respond to any of it. The divorce took 11 months. The financial misconduct documentation was significant. The settlement reflected that. I kept the house, which I have since finished most of the projects on, mostly alone on weekends, which has turned out to be its own strange form of processing. Howard keeps me company. He is an excellent dog and was not fooled by any of this for a moment, which I take some comfort in. I am 39 now. I have 2 more years of experience than I did when I thought I'd finally figured out how to get something important right, and I'm choosing to believe that counts for something. Most days I manage it, and that story is over. $42,000 on a secret credit card. Timed withdrawals from a joint account calibrated to stay under notification thresholds. A girls' trip that was a weekend in Montreal. This is not a person who made a mistake and didn't know how to undo it. This is someone who managed a parallel life with the same methodical patience they used to convince their partner they were trustworthy in the first place. The most devastating detail is that the very qualities he fell in love with, her steadiness, her patience, her consistency, were the same qualities she used to maintain the deception. The thing that saved him was that he had the same qualities, and he turned them on the problem before he turned them on her. Filing first, telling her after, keeping the dog. All of it correct. Though, sometimes the most important thing you can do when you discover that someone has been running a long game against you is simply run a better one. Our next story comes from someone who thought they were healing from a painful breakup, only to discover that the betrayal they thought they'd already survived had a second layer they hadn't seen coming, and that it involved the person they'd turned to for support in the aftermath. I broke up with my girlfriend of 2 years, Amber, in February. The breakup was mutual in the sense that we both said the words and both agreed it wasn't working. But it wasn't mutual in the sense that she had wanted it to end for months before I was willing to admit the same thing. When it finally happened, I was gutted in the way you are when something ends that you'd been hoping would fix itself. That specific grief of losing something that was already gone. My friend group at the time consisted of people I'd known for various lengths of time. But my closest friend was a woman named Sasha. Sasha and I had been friends for 6 years. She'd been there through previous relationships and their endings, through job changes and apartment moves, and the difficult 2 years after my father got sick. She was the person I called when things went wrong, and she called me the same way. We were not, and had never been, romantically involved. This is not that kind of story, or it's not only that kind of story. The night of the breakup, Sasha came over with food and stayed until 1 a.m. She listened to everything and said the right things, and in the morning texted to check on me, before I'd even gotten out of bed. She was, and as she had always been, exactly the friend I needed. What I didn't know was that Sasha and Amber had been talking privately throughout my relationship with Amber. Not in the way that people's social groups naturally overlap. They hadn't been close before Amber and I started dating, but in a way that was separate and deliberate, and had been going on for 1.5 years of my 2-year relationship. I found this out 5 months after the breakup, in a way that had nothing to do with either of them volunteering it. I was helping Sasha move apartments. She'd found a new place across the city, and I spent a Saturday helping her box things up. And I found in a box of miscellaneous items I was packing from her desk, a printed photograph. It was a photograph of Sasha and Amber, together at what looked like a wine bar, and they were leaning toward each other across a small table, both laughing. The posture of 2 people who were entirely comfortable with each other. The timestamp on the photo strip in the corner. It had been printed from a photo booth, the old-fashioned kind. Showed a date 14 months ago, when Amber and I were fully together. When Sasha had never once mentioned seeing Amber independently. I put the photograph in my pocket and kept packing and said nothing. That night I went home and thought about every conversation I could remember having with Sasha about my relationship with Amber. There had been a lot of them, I'd been open with her in the way you're open with someone you trust completely. Frustrations, vulnerabilities, private dynamics, things that didn't reflect well on me, things that didn't reflect well on Amber. I thought about how much information I'd handed Sasha about my own relationship, and I thought about where that information might have gone. I called a mutual friend of ours named James, who had a tendency toward accidental honesty that I'd always privately appreciated. I told him I'd found something and asked him what he knew. James was quiet for a moment and then said, "I thought you knew." I've thought that for a while. He said Sasha and Amber had been close for most of the previous 2 years. He said he'd assumed it was one of those things that existed in the gaps between relationships and that everyone silently agreed not to address directly. He said he didn't know the specific nature of it, and I believe him on that. I sat with the photograph and what James had told me, and I thought about what bothered me most. It wasn't the friendship itself. People are allowed to have friendships that don't run through me. What bothered me was the information flow. Every private thing I told Sasha about my relationship, every frustration I'd confided, every vulnerability I'd shown in the context of what I thought was a protected friendship, I had to now consider that all of it had traveled somewhere. That the person I processed my relationship with had also been in a private relationship with the person I was processing it about. That I had been functionally confiding in both sides of my own relationship without knowing it. I also thought about the 5 months after the breakup. All the things I'd said to Sasha about how I was doing, about how I thought about Amber, about what I wished had gone differently. Where had that gone? I met Sasha for coffee 2 weeks after I found the photograph. I brought it with me. I set it on the table between us and watched her face. She looked at it for a long moment and then looked at me and said, "I was going to tell you." I said nothing. She said it had developed slowly and she hadn't known how to bring it up, and then it had gone on long enough that bringing it up felt impossible, and she'd convinced herself it wasn't relevant because she'd always kept my confidence. I asked her to define keeping my confidence. She said she'd never shared anything specific that I told her in private. I don't know if that's true. I find it difficult to believe. Not because Sasha is a bad person, but because I know how conversations work, especially between two people who share a mutual subject. Only things slip out in the texture of normal conversation. Details emerge. I don't think she sat down and deliberately reported my private thoughts to Amber. I also don't think a 1.5 years of close friendship with my girlfriend left my private life entirely undiscussed. I told Sasha that I wasn't angry at the friendship existing. I was angry at the choice to keep it hidden from me for a 1.5 years, while actively being the person I processed my relationship with. I told her that the deception, because that's what sustained concealment is, even when nothing dramatic happens, had changed something I couldn't change back, which was my certainty about what our friendship actually was and what it had actually contained. I told her I needed time and I wasn't sure how much. I haven't spoken to Sasha in 4 months. I'm still not sure what I want that friendship to be if it continues. The loss of it, honestly, has been harder than the end of the relationship with Amber, because I expected to lose Amber, and I did not expect to lose Sasha. And the things I grieve about losing Sasha are 6 years deep, in a way that 2 years never was. Amber and Sasha, I've heard, are still close. I try not to think about what the last 2 years look like from inside that friendship. I try not to think about which of my confided words were present in the room with both of them. That story is over. The specific pain of this one is different from the others because the betrayal isn't romantic. It's structural. It's the discovery that the container you put your most private thoughts into was not sealed the way you believed it was. Already the photograph in the moving box is such a specific kind of gut punch because it's proof delivered by accident. which is somehow worse than being confronted with it directly. There's no confrontation planned, no speech prepared, just a person packing boxes and then standing in a room, holding an image of a reality they weren't supposed to know about. The fact that the friendship loss is harder than the relationship loss is the most honest thing in the whole story, and anyone who has ever lost a best friend will understand it immediately. Sometimes the cruelest part of a betrayal isn't what it takes from you. It's the retroactive uncertainty it casts over everything you thought you knew. Every conversation you trusted, every private thing you handed over, believing it was safe. Well, our next story comes from someone who discovered that the person they'd planned an entire future with had made a decision that dismantled that future without ever telling them, and had been living in the aftermath of that decision in secret for over a year. My partner of 5 years, Ryan, and I had talked about having children from early in our relationship. It wasn't a topic we stumbled into. We addressed it deliberately, early, the way adults are supposed to when they're considering building a life together. We both said yes. We both meant it. Or I meant it, and I believed he did. We had names we liked and rough timelines we'd sketched out and a general sense of the shape of the life we were moving toward. We started trying about 18 months into living together. It wasn't urgent at first. We were both in our early 30s, and the timelines we discussed were loose enough that we weren't anxious about it. But after 6 months of nothing, I started paying more attention. After 9 months, I suggested we both get checked out, just to make sure everything was as it should be. Ryan agreed easily and said he'd schedule something. He didn't schedule anything. When I followed up a month later, he said he'd been busy and would get to it. When I brought it up again 2 months after that, he said he'd already had some preliminary blood work done through his regular physical, and everything looked fine. I asked if he'd seen a specialist specifically. He said it wasn't necessary yet, that we should keep trying naturally for a little longer before escalating. I made my own appointment. My results came back normal across every metric. My doctor asked about my partner's results, and I realized I had no actual documentation of what Ryan had or hadn't been checked for. I told her I'd follow up and went home and asked Ryan directly to show me whatever results he'd received. He was quiet for a long time. We were in the kitchen and he was standing at the counter, and he didn't look at me while he was quiet, which was itself information. Then he told me he hadn't had any testing done. I asked him why he told me he had. He said he hadn't wanted to deal with it yet. I said that we had been trying for over a year, and asked what exactly he'd been waiting to be ready to deal with. He said he needed to tell me something. Ryan had a vasectomy 14 months earlier. He'd scheduled it, gone through with it, and recovered from it. During a week, he told me, was a work conference in Phoenix. He had not told me. He had continued to engage in our attempts to conceive for 14 months, after making himself incapable of conceiving. While I charted cycles and adjusted my diet and took supplements and attended a medical appointment to investigate why nothing was working, for 14 months, he had watched me do all of that and said nothing. I want to be careful here because I know that a person's bodily autonomy includes their reproductive choices, and I genuinely believe that as a principle. What Ryan did not have the right to do was make a unilateral choice that directly affected a shared plan we had explicitly made together, conceal it from me for over a year, and allow me to invest emotionally and physically in a process he'd already secretly ended. Those are two different things, and I am precise about that distinction. I asked him why. I want to say I asked calmly, and mostly I did. He said he'd started to realize over the previous couple of years that he wasn't sure he wanted children, the way he'd said he did, that his certainty had eroded, and he'd been frightened to tell me because he knew it was a deal breaker, and he didn't want to lose me. He said the vasectomy had felt like buying himself time to figure out how to have the conversation. I asked how 14 months of watching me try to get pregnant counted as buying time to have the conversation. He didn't have a good answer for that. I left that evening and stayed with my sister for a week. And during that week, I talked to her, and I talked to a therapist I'd seen briefly years ago. And I sat with what I knew and what it meant. What it meant, when I held it clearly, was this. Ryan had known for at least 2 years that he no longer wanted what we'd agreed to want together. Instead of telling me, which would have been painful, and might have ended the relationship, which was what he feared, he had chosen to manage the situation by removing the possibility, without my knowledge, while maintaining the performance of the plan. He had made my reproductive timeline, which was not infinite, his to control. He had taken a decision that belonged to both of us, and made it unilaterally, and then hidden it, and in doing so, he had consumed 14 months of my life that I could not get back. I was 34. That 14 months is not nothing at 34. I went home after a week because it was my home too, and I wasn't going to be the one who left it. Ryan and I had one more long conversation that covered everything: his fear, his reasoning, his awareness throughout those 14 months that what he was doing was wrong, his inability to find a way out of it that he could tolerate. I heard all of it. I believe he was telling me the truth, finally, about all of it. I also told him clearly that the why, while I understood it, did not constitute a justification for what he had chosen to do, and that I needed him to understand that distinction as plainly as I did. We tried to stay together for 2 months after that. It didn't work. Not because I couldn't eventually forgive the decision itself, maybe. I asked with time. But because I had looked at the 14 months and understood that when Ryan was afraid of losing something, he was capable of sustaining a significant deception indefinitely, rather than risk a difficult conversation. That was information about who he was under pressure. It was information I couldn't unknow. He moved out on a Sunday. He was quiet and cooperative about the logistics, which I appreciated. Before he left, he apologized again, more specifically than before. He named the things he'd taken from me, the time and the medical appointment and the emotional investment. And he said he was sorry for each of them individually, in a way that showed he'd been thinking about it carefully. It was the most honest thing he'd done in over a year, and I told him I heard it, and I thanked him for it. I am currently working with a fertility specialist on my own. I have good options and I am pursuing them. I am also, on most days, genuinely okay, which surprises me sometimes when I notice it. That story is over. The most precise and painful thing in this entire story is the phrase buying himself time to have the conversation. Because 14 months of watching someone invest in a process you've already secretly ended is not buying time to have a conversation. That's just not having the conversation while something real is lost. The distinction he draws between bodily autonomy and the right to make unilateral changes to a shared plan is exactly right, and it matters that he names it clearly. Because those two things get collapsed together in discussions like this, when they are not the same thing at all. What makes this particular betrayal so specific is that it wasn't about desire for someone else. It was about fear. Fear of the conversation, fear of the loss, fear of what honesty would cost. And sometimes the cruelest betrayals aren't the ones that come from wanting something. They're the ones that come from being too afraid to tell the truth, until the truth has already taken something that can't be returned. Our next story comes from someone who spent years as part of what they believed was an honest, reciprocal friendship before discovering that the person they trusted with the most formative years of their adult life had been quietly building their career on a foundation that didn't belong to them. My best friend through my entire 20s was a woman named Phoebe. We met at 22 at our first real jobs out of college. Both of us entry-level, both of us ambitious. Both of us figuring out who we were, professionally and personally at the same time. We rose through our respective fields together in that parallel way, where you're not in competition because you're in different industries, but you're in constant conversation, always sharing, always pushing each other, always the first call after a win or a setback. I am a writer. I worked in journalism for 6 years before transitioning to long-form work and eventually writing a book. Phoebe was in marketing, which overlapped with my world enough that we spoke the same professional language. We talked about work constantly, ideas, approaches, things we were developing, things we were stuck on. I shared early drafts with her. I talked through concepts before they were fully formed. She was a thinking partner in the truest sense, and I trusted her with things that weren't ready to exist, outside of my own head yet. The book took me 4 years to write. It was a narrative nonfiction work about a specific community, and I had spent years reporting it, building relationships with sources, developing a thesis and a structure and a voice for the material. Phoebe knew the project intimately. She'd read multiple drafts, given feedback at every stage, and celebrated every milestone with me. When it was finally published, she threw me a party. She gave a toast. She said I was the most dedicated writer she knew. The book did well, better than I'd expected. It received attention in ways that opened new doors for me professionally, and I was genuinely proud of it in a way that felt earned in proportion to what it had cost. About 14 months after publication, a mutual acquaintance sent me an article. It was a marketing thought leadership piece, published in a trade publication, authored by Phoebe. The acquaintance had sent it with a neutral note, saying she'd come across it and thought I might find it interesting. I found it interesting. The structural argument at the center of Phoebe's article was one I recognized, not vaguely, specifically. It was a framework I had developed over the course of my reporting, and first articulated clearly in a conversation with Phoebe about 3 years before my book was published. I remember the conversation because it was one of those moments where something clicked into place for me, where I said something out loud and understood that I'd found the spine of what I was trying to build. I had written about it in an email to Phoebe the same day, because that was how we operated. Ideas captured immediately, sent to each other while they were still warm. The article didn't use my language exactly. It was written in Phoebe's voice and applied to a marketing context rather than a journalistic one. But the underlying architecture, the specific way of framing the relationship between 3 elements that I had spent weeks trying to find the right language for, was mine. Presented as hers without attribution and a publication that reached the professional audience she was trying to impress. I went to my email archive. The email I had sent Phoebe the afternoon of that conversation was still there, time-stamped with the framework described in enough detail to be unambiguous. I forwarded it to myself, and I sat with it for a few days. I want to be honest that I went back and forth about how to handle this. Phoebe and I had shared ideas freely for years. In the course of any close intellectual friendship, things transfer. Influence is not the same as theft. But there is a line between being influenced by someone's thinking and lifting the specific structural core of an idea they shared with you in confidence and publishing it under your own name in a professional context without acknowledgement. I knew which side of that line this was on. I called Phoebe and told her I'd read the article. I told her I recognized the framework and explained where I recognized it from. I was direct but not aggressive. I genuinely wanted to hear what she would say. There was a pause, and then she said she didn't think of it as my idea specifically, that it had come out of our conversations together, that ideas developed in dialogue belonged to the conversation rather than one person. I asked her if she would have said the same thing if I had published a piece, using a framework she'd developed and described to me in detail. She was quiet again. She said that wasn't the same thing. I asked her to explain the difference. She couldn't do it in a way that held together, and I think she knew it. I told her that what bothered me most wasn't the article. It was the question the article raised about the years before it, about every idea I'd shared in early stages, every framework I was still developing. every half-formed thing I'd handed to her during the years we'd spent as thinking partners. I told her I'd always believed that what I shared with her existed in a protected space, and that the article had given me reason to doubt that, and that doubting it meant I had to reconsider what I thought I knew about the preceding decade. She said I was being dramatic. That response ended the conversation faster than anything else could have. I have not spoken to Phoebe since that call, which was 7 months ago. I've heard she's told mutual friends that I ended the friendship over a misunderstanding, which is one way to frame it. Another way to frame it is that she published someone else's intellectual work under her own name, and when confronted, explained that ideas developed in dialogue belong to the conversation, which is a principle she applied only in the direction that benefited her. The email still exists, time-stamped. I don't know what I'll ever do with it. Probably nothing. But there's something about having it that matters to me. The record of the day I found the right language for something. Evidence that the thing was mine. That I said it first in a message to the person who later decided it was hers. That story is over. The detail that lands hardest is the response when confronted. I don't think of it as your idea specifically. It came out of our conversations. That reframe is so precisely constructed to sound reasonable, while being completely self-serving, and the test the narrator applies is exactly right. Would you say the same thing if I'd done it to you? The silence that follows that question is the answer. What makes this betrayal particularly cutting is the specific intimacy it corrupts. This wasn't a stranger's idea or a colleague's work. This was the thing she ran to Phoebe's, with the same afternoon she figured it out, still warm, offered in the fullest trust of a decade-long friendship. The email sitting in that archive, time-stamped, undeniable, is its own quiet form of justice. Not the explosive kind, but the kind where the truth simply exists, documented and permanent, regardless of what anyone chooses to say about it. Oh, sometimes the record is enough. Sometimes knowing what's true and knowing you can prove it is the most solid ground you can stand on when someone has tried to shift the terrain. Our next story comes from someone who thought they had escaped a painful chapter of their life cleanly, only to discover that the person who had hurt them most had followed them into the next chapter in a way they hadn't seen coming and couldn't have anticipated. I left my ex-husband, Daniel, after 7 years of marriage. I won't detail everything that the marriage was because some of it is still too recent and some of it belongs only to me. But the short version is that it was not a good marriage for the last 4 of those 7 years, and I stayed longer than I should have because leaving felt enormous in a way that was hard to make myself face. When I finally left, I did it properly. Therapy, a lawyer, a plan, a support system. I moved to a different city, not to hide, but because I had a job opportunity, and I was ready to be somewhere that didn't have 7 years of history pressed into every street corner. I gave myself a year before I started dating again. I was deliberate about that timeline. I used the year well, built a life in the new city, made friends, got comfortable being alone in a way I hadn't been since my early 20s. When I felt ready, I joined a couple of dating apps and approached the whole thing with low expectations and genuine openness, which is probably the right combination. I met someone I'll call Theo about 8 months into dating. He was thoughtful and unhurried, and we had a natural rapport from the first conversation. We dated for 5 months before I introduced him to my close friends into the new city, which felt like a significant step and one I didn't take lightly. My friends liked him. He fit into the life I'd built. About 2 months after that, a friend from my old city came to visit for a weekend. Her name is Carrie, and she had been one of my primary supports during the divorce. She knew Daniel, had watched the marriage deteriorate, had been present for some of the worst parts of the end. She met Theo over dinner on the first night of her visit and was warm and easy with him, the way she is with everyone. The next morning, over coffee, While Theo was at the gym, Carrie asked me how much I'd told him about my marriage. I said I'd given him the general shape of things, that it had been difficult, that I'd left, that I'd needed time before I was ready to date again. She asked if I knew anything about his background, his previous relationships. I said what he'd told me, which was the normal amount a person shares in the early months of a relationship. Carrie put her mug down. She told me that she'd recognized Theo the previous evening and hadn't wanted to say anything in front of him until she was sure. She was sure. She had seen Theo before, not in person, but in a photograph. She had seen that photograph in the context of Daniel's life. Theo was not a stranger to my ex-husband. They knew each other. She didn't know the nature or depth of the connection, but she knew the photograph and she knew the context, and she said she'd been up most of the night trying to figure out if she was certain enough to tell me. She was certain enough. I sat with that information for the rest of the morning. Theo came back from the gym, and I watched him move around my apartment with the ease of someone who had become comfortable there, making coffee and asking Carrie questions about herself. And I looked at him differently than I had the day before. Not with certainty about what it meant yet, with the specific alertness of someone who has learned from hard experience that the shape of a situation can be completely different from how it presents. After Carrie left on Sunday afternoon, I waited until Theo and I were settled in the evening, and I told him that my friend had recognized him and that she had placed him in the context of my ex-husband's life. I told him I wasn't accusing him of anything specific, and I wasn't approaching the conversation with a verdict already reached. I said I was asking him to tell me the truth about whether he knew Daniel and how. Theo was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then he said yes. He said he knew Daniel. They had been colleagues several years ago, at a company both of them had since left. He said they hadn't been close and had fallen out of contact. He said he hadn't connected my ex-husband's name to me when I mentioned I'd been previously married because I use my maiden name now, and Daniel's last name was common enough that the connection hadn't registered. It was a plausible explanation delivered in a careful and measured way, and I want to be honest, that part of me wanted to accept it. Theo had been good to me. The relationship had felt genuinely healthy, in ways that mattered to me after years of something that wasn't. Accepting his explanation would have been the easier path, but I had learned, at significant cost, to trust the sensation of something not sitting right. The sensation was present, so instead of accepting the explanation, I asked some specific questions. I asked when exactly he'd last had contact with Daniel. He said 2 or 3 years ago. I asked if they followed each other on any social media. He said he didn't think so. I asked if he was certain he hadn't known who I was before we matched on the app. That last question produced another pause. Shorter this time, but there. He said he hadn't been certain. He said Daniel's social media, which he did still follow on one platform, contrary to what he'd just told me, had mentioned a divorce in a way that had made him curious about who Daniel's ex-wife was. He said when he came across my profile, he thought it might be me, and that he had been attracted to my profile, and told himself that the connection to Daniel was distant enough not to matter. I want to take a moment with what he'd just told me, because I think it's important to be precise. He had known or strongly suspected who I was before we matched. He had chosen not to disclose that. He had allowed 5 months of a relationship to develop, had met my friends, had become comfortable in my home, had listened to me talk about my marriage and my divorce and my careful year of healing, without telling me that he had prior knowledge of who I was and how he'd come to be curious about me. And his first response when I asked directly had been to say he'd had no contact with Daniel for years and didn't follow him on social media, neither of which was true. I told him I needed him to leave for the evening. He tried to continue the conversation, and I told him clearly and without anger that I was not able to have it productively that night and that I needed the space. He left. I spent that night making a mental inventory of everything I'd shared with Theo about my marriage. The texture of what those years had been, the specific ways Daniel had operated that had taken me so long to name clearly. The fears I still carried, the progress I'd made. All of it offered openly, the way you offer things to someone you're choosing to trust, not knowing they had arrived with a prior frame of reference they'd chosen not to disclose. I also spent some time thinking about probability. It was possible this was a coincidence that had compounded, a genuine initial attraction that happened to involve someone peripherally connected to my past, and an escalating discomfort about disclosing it that produced the lies, without any darker motive behind it. That was possible. I could not, however, rule out the alternative. I could not rule out that the connection to Daniel was not peripheral. I could not verify what Theo knew about me before we met, what he and Daniel might have discussed, whether the relationship had been initiated with intent. I talked to my therapist the next day. She was careful and didn't tell me what to do, which is her way, but she helped me articulate something I'd been circling. She said, "The question of whether there was malicious intent may never be answerable, and waiting for a certain answer before responding means remaining in a situation that already contains clear, confirmed dishonesty. The dishonesty itself, the decision to pursue me, knowing who I was, the social media lie, the silence across 5 months, was real regardless of the motive behind it. The motive was a separate question I might never resolve. I ended the relationship with Theo the following week. I met him in a public place, and I told him clearly what my reasoning was. Not the unresolvable question of intent, but the confirmed facts of what he had concealed, and what he had lied about when asked directly. He apologized. He said he understood. He said he had genuinely cared about the relationship, which I acknowledged without accepting as a reason to continue it. He asked if there was any version of things where we could try again with everything on the table. I told him that the problem wasn't the information he'd withheld. It was the active lie told in the moment of direct questioning, which told me something about how he operated under pressure that I couldn't unknow. He nodded and didn't argue with that. I have not spoken to him since. I called Carrie that evening and told her what had happened and thanked her for saying something, which she'd struggled to decide to do. She said she'd almost convinced herself to stay out of it, and I told her I was glad she hadn't. Daniel, I assume, knows nothing about any of this. I have not told him. He is not a significant enough presence in my current life to warrant a conversation about it. What he cost me 7 years ago is separate from this. What this cost me is its own smaller, more particular loss. 5 months of something that felt like genuine recovery, complicated now by the knowledge that it may have started as something else entirely. I'm still in the new city. I'm still building the life I came here to build. I am more careful now, in ways that feel necessary and also slightly sad, the way any new caution does when it comes from somewhere it shouldn't have had to come from. That story is over. The detail that makes this one so specifically unsettling is the pause before his answer to the last question. Shorter, but there. The narrator notices it, and we notice it with her. And in that half second, the whole explanation shifts from plausible to constructed. What her therapist says is the most important thing in the story. The question of intent may never be answerable, and waiting for certainty before responding means staying in something that already contains confirmed dishonesty. That reframe is exactly right, and it matters. Because so much of what keeps people in situations they should leave is the reasonable desire to be fair, to not act on suspicion, to wait for a certainty that the other person is uniquely positioned to withhold. The confirmed lie in the moment of direct questioning is the answer, regardless of what it was protecting. Sometimes the specific shape of someone's dishonesty tells you everything you need to know about how they'll operate when it costs them something. And that information is a gift, even when it doesn't feel like one. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the person they'd been closest to for most of their adult life had been carrying a secret that reframed the entire history of what they thought they'd shared. My relationship with my sister Diane has been the most constant one of my life. We are 4 years apart, she's older, and we grew up in a household that required us to be each other's allies in ways that made us closer than most siblings I've observed. She was my first call for everything. I was hers. When she got married at 31, I stood beside her. When I went through a health scare at 29, she flew in without being asked. We talked on the phone twice a week with the regularity of a standing appointment neither of us ever questioned. I got engaged 18 months ago, and my fiancé's name is Patrick, and Diane liked him immediately and expressed that clearly, which mattered to me more than I could fully articulate, because her approval had always been the one I weighted most. We started planning the wedding together. She was my maid of honor, and she approached the role with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, organized and thoughtful, and completely present. About 8 months into the engagement, Patrick and I hit a rough patch. Nothing catastrophic. A period of high stress and poor communication that I recognized as fixable, but that required work. I talked to Diane about it at length multiple times. She listened and gave good counsel and said all the things a loving sister says without overstepping. I was grateful for her in those conversations in the particular way. You're grateful when someone handles something delicate carefully. The wedding is in 4 months. 3 weeks ago, Patrick came to me with something he said he'd been holding on to and didn't know how to tell me. He looked like a person who had rehearsed a speech and found at the moment of delivery that rehearsal hadn't been enough. He told me that during the rough patch 8 months ago, at the lowest point of it, he had confided in Diane. They had always gotten along easily, and she had reached out to him during that period, separately from her conversations with me, to check in. He said it had felt supportive at first, someone in my corner, also concerned about the health of our relationship. The conversations had continued. They became a regular thing, a parallel track to the ones she and I were having. He told me that in one of those conversations, Diane had told him that she had concerns about whether I was ready to be someone's partner, long term, that she thought I had patterns that were difficult to live with, that she'd watched relationships in my life not work out, and had her own theories about my role in those endings. He said she'd framed it as honesty, offered out of care for him, as someone who wanted him to go into the marriage with clear eyes. Patrick told me that those conversations had contributed to his doubt during that period, that they had been part of what made the rough patch rougher than it might have been. He told me because he said he was no longer comfortable having that information and not having me have it, and that going into a marriage with something like that sitting unacknowledged felt like the wrong way to start. I called Diane after that conversation, and I told her what Patrick had told me. I want to be specific about what I told her, because I was specific. I did not ask her if it was true. I told her that Patrick had shared the content of their private conversations with me, and that I needed to understand why she had done what she had done. I gave her nothing to confirm or deny, just the fact that I knew. Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she said that she'd been trying to protect him, that she'd seen things in our relationship that worried her, and she'd rather tell him privately than bring them to me in a way that felt like an attack. She said she loved me, and that everything she'd said to him had come from a place of genuine concern. I asked her why the conversations had been private. If her concerns were honest and caring, why were they delivered to my fiancé behind my back in a series of conversations she'd never mentioned to me? She said she hadn't wanted to hurt me. I said that telling the man I was going to marry that she had theories about why my relationships fail was a choice about what to protect, and it wasn't me. I have been sitting with this for 3 weeks. The specific quality of this betrayal is that it comes dressed so thoroughly in love, Diane would, if asked, pass a sincerity test. She believes she was helping. She is not cynical or malicious, and that is somehow the hardest part. because the wound is the same size regardless of the intent behind it. She went around me to the person most positioned to be affected by her doubts about me, and she did it consistently over months, and she never told me. I don't know what my relationship with Diane looks like from here. The wedding is in 4 months, and she is still my maid of honor on paper. I haven't made any decisions about that yet. I find I can't look at certain photographs of us right now, the ones from her wedding especially, where I'm beside her at the altar, and I look completely certain. The way you look when you're standing next to someone you believe entirely. Patrick and I are okay. Telling me cost him something, and I'm grateful he did it anyway. We're in couples therapy now and talking about everything, which is probably what the rough patch was always pointing toward. He said he'd been carrying it for 8 months, and it had felt like a slow leak he couldn't locate. And now that it was out in the open, he could breathe again. I understand that feeling. I'm still finding my way to it. That story is over. The line that lands like a stone dropping is, "It wasn't me," because it's exactly right, and it cuts through all the stated good intentions in one stroke. Diane made a choice about what to protect, and it was her own comfort in delivering the concerns over her sister's right to know they were being delivered. The framing of it as care doesn't survive that question. If it came from love, why was it private? Why told to him and not to her? The love may be real and the betrayal is still real. Both things completely true at the same time, and that coexistence is what makes this category of wound so difficult to heal. Patrick telling her is its own act of loyalty that deserves to be named. He carried something for 8 months that was actively working against his relationship, and chose honesty over comfort when it would have been very easy not to. Sometimes the person who restores your ability to trust is the one who tells you the thing that temporarily makes trusting harder. Our next story comes from someone who thought they had built a genuine community around themselves, only to discover that the architecture of that community had been constructed by someone else for reasons that had nothing to do with friendship. I moved to a new city at 26 for a job, and I knew almost no one. The first year was genuinely lonely in the specific way that adult loneliness is. Not dramatic, just the daily small weight of having no one to call for low-stakes things. No one to meet for a drink without planning it a week in advance. No one who knew my face well enough to read it when something was wrong. I met a woman named Vanessa at a work event about 14 months in. She was magnetic in the way that certain people are. Funny and warm and immediately interested in whoever she was talking to. In a way that made you feel specifically chosen. We became friends fast. She had an established social world in the city, and she brought me into it without ceremony, introducing me to people as though I'd always been part of the group, creating the conditions for friendships that then developed on their own terms. I was grateful to her in a way that was probably more intense than I fully acknowledged to myself. I had been lonely, and then I wasn't, and Vanessa was the reason. That kind of gratitude creates a particular vulnerability that I didn't fully understand until later. Over the following 2 years, the social world Vanessa had introduced me to became genuinely mine. I had close friends within it, connections that existed independently of her. I had what I would have described, without hesitation, as a real community. I started dating a man named Elliot about a year into this period. He was not part of Vanessa's social world. I'd met him through work, and he and Vanessa never particularly clicked, which I attributed to personality differences and didn't think much about. Vanessa would occasionally make comments about Elliot that I chalked up to the protective instincts of a close friend. Small observations that I noted and set aside. Elliot and I broke up after 14 months for reasons unrelated to anyone in this story. A genuine incompatibility that we'd both eventually been honest about. In the months after the breakup, Vanessa was attentive and present. She organized things for me to do when I might otherwise have been sitting alone in my apartment. She checked in consistently, and was exactly the kind of friend you want in that period. About 4 months after the breakup, a woman in our friend group named Priya told me something over dinner that she'd been debating telling me for a while. She prefaced it with that exactly. She'd been debating it, which I've come to recognize as people doing their moral accounting out loud before they change something. Priya told me that Vanessa had been in contact with Elliot throughout our relationship. Not in a way Priya could prove was romantic. She was careful about that. But consistently and privately, in a way she found strange. She said she'd seen them texting at a group event and mentioned it to Vanessa later, and Vanessa had explained it away easily. But it had stayed with her. And then when Elliot and I broke up, and she watched Vanessa's response, the attentiveness, the way she organized the social calendar around my healing, something about it had felt like stage management rather than care. I sat with that for a week. Then I did something I would not normally do, which is look back through my own memories with a specific question in mind. The question was, what had Vanessa known about my relationship with Elliot that I'd told her, and what had the shape of her responses been? The pattern I found was subtle enough that I might have explained it differently at the time. When things with Elliot were good, Vanessa's comments were gently questioning, small doubts introduced with a light touch, things that were easy to dismiss but that accumulated. When things were harder, she was fully supportive of whatever I was feeling, which usually meant supportive of my frustration. She had not manufactured our incompatibility, which was real, but she had, consistently and over time, applied a light pressure in the direction of the conclusion she apparently wanted me to reach. I confronted Vanessa directly. She denied the contact with Elliot was significant and denied any intentionality in how she'd handled my relationship. She was composed and warm, and produced a version of events that was internally consistent. I have no hard proof of anything. I have Priya's observation, my own pattern recognition, and the fact that when I asked Vanessa if she'd had any contact with Elliot during our relationship, she paused before saying no, and the pause was specific and visible. 3 months after that conversation, Vanessa and Elliot were publicly together. I don't know exactly what to do with all of it. The relationship with Elliot was genuinely not going to work, and I know that clearly. What I can't unknow is the possibility that the person I credited with ending my loneliness had, for some portion of the time I trusted her, been running a separate agenda inside the friendship. What I can't fully assess is how much of the community I built with her help was built on honest ground. Those questions don't have clean answers, and I'm learning to accept that they might not. What I do know is that Priya told me the truth when she didn't have to. That Priya has become, in the months since all of this, one of the closest friends I have. That the community survived Vanessa, leaving it in a way I wouldn't have predicted. That adult loneliness is real, and the fear of returning to it can make you see a friendship as more stable and more clean than it actually is. Because the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with. I'm sitting with it now. Most days it's manageable. That story is over. And 3 months later, Vanessa and Elliot are publicly together. And that sentence does a lot of quiet work, because it doesn't prove the worst version of events. But it makes the worst version of events extremely difficult to dismiss. The detail about her stage managing the healing period is the one that reframes everything. The attentiveness, the organized social calendar, the consistent check-ins, all of it suddenly legible as someone managing a situation toward an outcome, rather than caring for a friend. The pause before saying no is the detail that matters most, because Vanessa is someone who handles herself composedly, and a pause from that person is significant. What Priya does by telling the truth is restore something the narrator lost when she started questioning the architecture of her own community. The ability to trust that certain friendships are exactly what they present as. No more complicated and no more compromised than they appear. Sometimes the most important thing a friendship can be is simply clean, uncomplicated, entirely itself. And sometimes you only understand how rare that is when you've been inside something that wasn't. Our next story comes from someone who thought they had experienced the full extent of a betrayal they'd already survived, and then discovered there was a chapter they hadn't known about, one that changed the shape of everything that came before it. I divorced my ex-wife Margot 4 years ago after discovering she'd had a relationship with a colleague for about 7 months of our marriage. The discovery and the divorce were painful, and in the proportions you'd expect. And I moved through them with the help of therapy and time and the gradual rebuilding that happens when you commit to it seriously. By 2 years out, I was genuinely okay. I had a clear and workable understanding of what had happened and why, and I had done the work of integrating it. What I did not have was a complete picture. I found out I didn't have a complete picture from an unlikely source, which was Margot herself. Or rather, from something Margot said in a conversation we had, because we share custody of our dog, an arrangement that has required us to maintain a functional civility. Now, we were arranging a handoff for the dog, a border collie named Fig, who we'd gotten together in the 2nd year of our marriage, and who has remained stubbornly attached to both of us in a way that made the shared custody feel less absurd than it sounds. And Margot made a reference in passing to a trip we'd taken early in our marriage. A long weekend in Vermont, the 2nd year we were together, which I remembered as one of the good periods. One of the stretches that made the eventual end harder to reconcile, because the distance between who we were then and what came later was so difficult to map. Margot said something offhand about that trip and then stopped herself in the middle of the sentence, and there was a quality to this stop that I recognized. She is someone I spent 9 years with, and I know her verbal patterns, as the stop of a person who has said slightly more than they intended, and is now making a quick internal calculation about whether to continue or redirect. She redirected. She finished the sentence differently than she'd started it, and moved on to logistics about Fig's medication schedule. I let it go in the moment. I did not let it go in the hours afterward. We had been married for 9 years, and together for 2 before that. The relationship with the colleague she'd admitted to had lasted 7 months in the final year of our marriage. That was the story I had built my understanding of the divorce around. 7 months, one person, late in a marriage that had already been deteriorating, and that story had a shape I could hold and examine and eventually set down. The Vermont trip had been in year 2, early, when I believed we were solid and still building. I called Margot 2 days later. I told her I'd been thinking about what she'd started to say about the Vermont trip, and I asked her to finish the sentence. There was a silence that was longer than any logistical conversation about a border collie would produce. Then she said she wasn't sure that opening that up was useful to anyone at this point. I told her I wasn't asking because I wanted to cause her difficulty. I told her I'd spent 4 years constructing a functional understanding of what our marriage had been and how it had ended, and that if her unfinished sentence contained information relevant to the understanding, I would rather have it than not have it. I said I believed I had the right to a complete picture of my own life. She was quiet again. Then she said the colleague had not been the first. I will give you the shape of what came out over the following conversation without giving you every piece of it, because some of it is still too specific to put into the world. The broad outline is this. There had been someone before the colleague, earlier in the marriage. The Vermont trip had been the beginning of something. Not a weekend away together, the way I'd experienced it, but a trip during which Margot had been in contact with someone in a way that had nothing to do with me. The relationship that developed from that contact had lasted longer than 7 months. It had overlapped with years I'd thought of as the good years. Years I used as the frame of reference for what the marriage had been at its best. Margot said she'd ended it herself, that it hadn't been discovered, that she'd told herself it was truly finished, and had never been going to tell me, because the marriage was still intact, and she believed she could repair what had been damaged without the repair requiring full disclosure. She said she'd spent years. afterward trying to be a better partner and believing that constituted a kind of private accounting. When the second relationship happened and the divorce followed, she'd made the decision to disclose only what was directly relevant to why we were ending. I asked her if she understood that the decision about what I needed to know in order to understand my own marriage had not been hers to make. She said she understood that. She said she was sorry in a way that carried the specific weight of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally put it down, regardless of where it lands. We finished the conversation and I sat in my car outside my apartment for a long time. Fig was on the seat beside me, unconcerned, which I found oddly grounding. The thing I had to work through in the weeks after that conversation was a particular and unexpected kind of grief. Not for the marriage. I had grieved that already, completely, in the proportions I believed were accurate. What I now had to grieve was the version of the marriage I'd been grieving. The story I'd told myself about what we'd been, at our best. The years I'd held up as evidence that it had been real and good before it went wrong. And that story had been partially constructed from information that was incomplete. The Vermont trip. A stretch of years I'd thought of as solid. I had to go back into a finished room and find that it wasn't finished. I went back to therapy for 2 months. Not because I was in crisis, I wasn't. But because I'd learned that grief is easier to move through, with accompaniment, and I had a specific and newly complicated thing to move through. My therapist made an observation that I've turned over many times since. She said that the incompleteness of the original disclosure had, in a way, protected the finished quality of my healing. That Margot's decision to tell me only what she believed I needed had given me a story with a clear shape and a real ending, and I'd been able to grieve that story and put it down, and the new information didn't undo the healing exactly. But it did require me to go back and do a supplementary piece of work I hadn't known I'd left undone. I'm not angry at Margot in the way I would have expected. I find that interesting. The anger at the original disclosure burned through its life cycle years ago, and what's left is something more like a flat and settled disappointment that the accounting she did privately, the deciding what I needed and didn't need to know, had been entirely on her terms. What I lost in the original betrayal was the marriage. What I lost in the second disclosure was a particular clean version of the past, a version I'd worked to arrive at that turned out to have been built on an incomplete foundation. That second loss is quieter and stranger, and harder to explain to people who haven't experienced something similar. Fig is doing fine. She divided her loyalty between us with complete even-handedness throughout the marriage, and has continued to do so through the divorce, which I've decided to take as a lesson in something. That story is over. The Vermont trip detail is the one that changes everything, not because of what happened there, but because the narrator had carried that trip for 4 years as one of the good memories, as evidence of what was real before things went wrong, and then learned it had been carrying something else inside it the entire time. The specific grief of having to re-enter a finished room and find it isn't finished is something you can only understand if you've had to do it. And the clarity with which this person describes it is remarkable. What Margot did was make a decision about what her partner needed to know about his own life, and that decision was made in her interest, dressed as consideration for his. The therapist's observation is the most precise thing in the story, that the incomplete disclosure had given him a clean story to grieve, and you can grieve a clean story, but you cannot grieve a story that keeps revealing new rooms. Sometimes the most complicated part of surviving a betrayal is learning that what you survived was a curated version of it, and the curator was the person who owed you the full truth. Our next story comes from someone who built what they believed was the most honest relationship of their life, only to discover that the honesty they'd been offered had been constructed to conceal the one thing that changed everything else. I want to start by saying that Marcus and I had the explicit conversation. The one where you sit across from each other in the early months of something and you talk about what you both actually want, where you're both actually at, what you're both actually capable of. We had that conversation more than once. Marcus was the first person I dated who seemed to approach relationships with the same precision and intentionality I did, who talked openly about attachment patterns and communication styles, and what had gone wrong in previous relationships and why. I am someone who has spent significant time understanding myself, and I found another person who seemed to operate the same way, genuinely rare and genuinely exciting. We had been together for 8 months when I started noticing a gap between what Marcus said and what Marcus did. Small gap at first. He described himself as someone who moved toward difficulty in relationships rather than away from it, who raised things instead of letting them calcify. But certain topics produced a careful sidestep that I began to notice precisely because his self-description had made me expect the opposite. I raised this with him, and he acknowledged it and said he was working on it, and I accepted that because working on something is a legitimate place to be. What I had not fully examined was whether the self-description was accurate or aspirational, whether Marcus was telling me who he was, or who he believed he was, or who he wanted to be. Those are 3 different things, and I had assumed they were the same because he was articulate and self-aware, and that combination had given me a confidence in his self-knowledge that wasn't entirely earned. At 10 months in, I found out Marcus was still in contact with his ex-partner in a way that exceeded what he'd told me. He described the relationship as finished and said they had no ongoing contact. What was true was that it was finished in the romantic sense, and that they had consistent contact. They both apparently considered friendship. I found out through a mutual acquaintance mentioning something casually, assuming I knew. I didn't know. When I raised it with Marcus, he said he hadn't thought of it as significant enough to mention. I told him that its significance wasn't his alone to determine, particularly given what he'd told me, and that the gap between what he'd said and what was true was the issue, not the friendship itself. He apologized, and it was a good apology. Specific, undefensive, aware of the precise nature of what he'd gotten wrong. I accepted it. We moved forward. What I didn't do, and this is the thing I've examined most closely since, was update my assessment of his self-knowledge based on that incident. I had evidence that the gap between who he described himself as and how he actually operated was larger than I'd realized. I noted it, and then, because the apology was good and the relationship was otherwise strong, I allowed my original assessment to reassert itself. I gave the evidence less weight than it deserved. 8 months after that, 14 months into the relationship overall, I found out that the contact with the ex-partner had continued and had expanded in ways that exceeded friendship by any definition I would apply to the word. Not through Marcus telling me, through the ex-partner posting something on social media that existed in a publicly visible space and contained enough context for anyone who knew Marcus to understand what it was describing. I want to be careful about the ex-partner here because she is not the primary subject of this story. She believed, from what I can reconstruct, that she and Marcus were working towards something, that their situation was more complicated than I was aware of, that the nature of his relationship with me was something other than what it was. She had been given incomplete information too. Ati, that matters, and I want it acknowledged. I called Marcus and read him what I'd seen. He did not attempt to reframe it. He said he'd been managing 2 situations simultaneously and hadn't known how to bring them together or separate them, and had consequently continued both indefinitely without resolution. He said he was sorry. He said it had never been his intention to hurt either of us. He said the self-awareness he'd always prided himself on had failed him here, because the one area where he consistently avoided looking directly at himself was the area involving what he actually wanted versus what he told himself and others he wanted. That last part, I believe, is completely true. It's also a precise description of a person who is capable of describing their own psychology with great accuracy while maintaining a significant blind spot about their own behavior. The self-awareness and the self-deception were not in contradiction. They coexisted, and I had mistaken the presence of one for the absence of the other. I ended the relationship that evening. I did not do it angrily, which surprised me in the moment and makes more sense in retrospect. I was not angry. I was tired in a specific way. The tiredness of someone who has invested significant care and attention in understanding another person, and then discovered that the understanding was partial, in a way that mattered. I told him clearly what I was doing and why, and said I hoped he would extend to himself the same honest examination he applied to everything else, and look directly at the thing he'd been looking away from. He sent me a letter 2 weeks later. I read it once. It was genuine and precise and showed real understanding of what he'd done and why. It was also too late, and I didn't respond to it. I think about the ex-partner sometimes. We've never spoken. She deserved better than she got too, from a completely separate direction, and I hold that. That story is over. The distinction between who someone is and who they believe they are and who they want to be is the precise center of this whole thing, and the narrator identified it early and then didn't fully trust their own identification, which is the most honest accounting of how this kind of thing unfolds. The self-awareness and the self-deception coexisting is the detail that explains how someone so apparently thoughtful produces such a specific and sustained failure of honesty. Marcus could describe his psychology with surgical precision in every direction, except the one that cost him something to look at. The tiredness, rather than anger at the end, is the most honest emotional response in the story, and the most recognizable. The exhaustion of someone who did the work of really knowing another person, and found the knowing was built on a gap they weren't told about. Sometimes the cruelest thing a person can do is give you real intimacy in every direction, but because the intimacy everywhere else makes the withheld thing feel like a betrayal of everything, not just itself. Our next story comes from someone who thought they had made a clean exit from a chapter of their life, and discovered instead that the chapter had continued without them, and had included people they trusted to tell them if it had. I ended a 5-year friendship with a woman named Greta about 2 years ago. The ending was mutual and civil. We'd grown in different directions, and the friendship had been running on inertia for the better part of a year, which we both acknowledged when we finally sat down and talked about it. I left that conversation feeling sad but clear, the way you feel when something concludes honestly. We said we'd always have warmth for each other, and I believed that, and I believe she meant it. What I did not know was that Greta was, at the time of that conversation, engaged in something that directly affected a third person in our orbit, a woman named B, who was a closer friend to me than Greta was, and who was also Greta's colleague. Greta had been systematically undermining B's professional reputation within their shared workplace for approximately 8 months. Small things, consistent things. The kind of targeted ambient damage that is difficult to identify and nearly impossible to confront directly. Attributing B's ideas to others in meetings, framing B's absences and limitations to mutual superiors in ways that were technically factual but selectively chosen, positioning herself as the competent and reliable alternative whenever comparison was available. I found this out from B 14 months after my friendship with Greta ended. B had spent those months documenting what was happening, trying to understand it, eventually connecting it to a professional opportunity she'd been passed over for, in a way that hadn't made sense until a colleague showed her some meeting notes that revealed how she'd been characterized in her absence. B had spent months trying to understand who could be doing it and why. And when she eventually arrived at Greta, through a combination of specific incidents and a conversation with a trusted colleague, who'd witnessed one instance directly, she had to sit with the knowledge that this person had also been my friend. B came to me not to ask me to do anything, she said, but because she felt I deserved to know that someone I'd been close to was capable of this. She showed me the documentation she'd compiled. It was thorough and careful, and the pattern it revealed was unambiguous. What I sat with for a long time afterward was not anger at Greta, exactly, though that was present. It was something more particular. In the final months of my friendship with Greta, when it was winding down but still nominally intact, I had talked with her about B. Normal friendship-to-friendship talk, B's job situation, things B was navigating, general life updates shared in the way you share information about people you both know. I had to now consider whether any of what I'd casually shared had been useful to Greta, whether the information I'd offered in the ordinary texture of friendship had been received with a purpose I hadn't known it was serving. I talked to B about this directly. I told her what I was sitting with and asked if there was anything in the documentation that suggested my conversations with Greta had been a source. She looked through what she had and said she couldn't connect anything specific. She said she didn't hold it against me and that she didn't believe I could have known. I believe she was telling me the truth, and I also know that full certainty in that direction is not available to me. I did not contact Greta. I thought about it at length and decided that whatever I could say to her wouldn't produce anything useful. Not accountability, not understanding. Nothing that would help B or help me. What I did instead was write everything down, in detail, in a document that exists in case Bay ever needs it. A record from someone who knew Greta well, during the relevant period, available if needed. Probably never needed. There regardless. B's professional situation has improved. She found a position at a different organization 8 months ago, and by all accounts is thriving in it, which is the outcome I most wanted, and the one I'm most grateful for. The friendship I have with B now is one of the more clear and uncomplicated things in my life, which is maybe the only clean thing to come out of any of this. The knowledge of who showed up and told the truth, and what that makes them. That story is over. The specific thing that makes this betrayal so insidious is that the damage was done in the margins of normal life, in meeting notes and casual characterizations, and the thousand small moments where reputation is built or quietly eroded, none of them dramatic enough to be confrontable on its own, but collectively devastating. The narrator's reckoning with what they may have inadvertently contributed is the most honest and least self-protective part of the story. Most people in that position would stop short of asking that question out loud. Writing the document that probably will never be used, but exists regardless, is exactly the right move. It's not revenge, it's a record. It's the quiet insistence that the truth has a witness even when there's no immediate use for it. Sometimes the best thing a betrayal leaves behind it is a clarity about who told the truth when they didn't have to, and that clarity is worth more than most things you can name. Our next story comes from someone who spent the better part of a decade believing a version of their own romantic history that turned out to have been authored, at least in part, by someone else. I was in a relationship at 24 with a man named Joel that ended badly in the specific way that first serious relationships sometimes end. Not with a single identifiable rupture, but with a gradual erosion that I didn't fully understand until years after it was over. We dated for 2 years. The last 8 months of it were difficult in ways I attributed, at the time, to the natural friction of two young people, figuring out who they were. We fought more, we connected less. I felt in the final stretch that I was working very hard to hold something together that Joel had quietly stopped investing in, though he never said that directly. When it ended, he said he'd been unhappy for a while and hadn't known how to tell me. I spent a long time after that, examining what I'd missed, what I should have seen, whether I'd been insufficiently attentive to something that was there to be read. I carried that self-examination further than was probably useful. For years afterward, I had a particular anxiety in relationships about missing signs, about being the last person to understand what was happening around me. I worked on it in therapy. I made progress. I understood it as a scar from a specific wound, and I treated it accordingly. What I found out 8 years later restructured the wound considerably. I was at a birthday dinner for a mutual friend when I ended up in a long conversation with a woman named Claire, who had been peripherally part of the social world Joel and I had shared. We'd always liked each other without ever becoming close, and the years had made the conversation easier, in the way they sometimes do. And we talked about the period after the breakup. She'd been around for the aftermath. And at some point, she said something that she clearly assumed I already knew. The way people sometimes do when they're talking about old events and forget to check whether the other person's version of the story matches theirs. She referenced a woman named Hannah. She spoke of Hannah in a context that assumed I knew who she was and what her relevance was. I did not know who she was. I asked. Claire stopped. She recalibrated. Then she told me that Hannah had been someone Joel was involved with in the final 4 months of our relationship, and that this had been known within that social circle at the time, and that she had assumed, had believed for 8 years, that I had known too, and had simply chosen not to speak about it publicly. I had not known. I had been the only person in that social world who hadn't known. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it deserves to be sat with. 8 years, a social circle of approximately 15 people who had been around the end of my relationship. Every one of whom, apparently, had been aware of something that was directly relevant to my experience of one of the most formative, painful periods of my adult life. Not one of whom had told me. Some of them I had remained close to. Some of them I had processed the end of that relationship with, in real conversations where I offered my own theories about what had gone wrong, and they had listened and responded, and never said the one thing that would have changed the entire shape of my understanding. I'm aware that people make complicated decisions about what to tell and what to withhold in situations like this. I am aware that it can feel like someone else's business, or like the information would only cause more pain, or like you're not certain enough or close enough to be the one to say something. I understand all of those rationalizations. I also know that I spent years in therapy, developing a specific anxiety about missing things that was partially built on a false foundation, and none of the 15 people who could have corrected that foundation chose to do so. I went home from that birthday dinner, and I sat with it for several days before deciding what to do with it. I was not going to find Joel. We had no contact, and I had no interest in a conversation with him at this point. The relationship was old enough and resolved enough that what he had done landed differently than it would have into the immediate aftermath. Not without weight, but differently. What I had more feelings about was the silence of the people who had known and said nothing. I reached out to 2 people from that old circle who I had remained genuinely close to. I told them what Claire had told me. I asked them directly whether they had known. Both of them said yes. Both of them offered explanations that were honest about the discomfort of the position they'd been in. One of them said she'd told herself I must have known. One of them said she'd started to say something once and hadn't been able to complete it, and then the moment had passed, and then the moment was too old. I listened to both of them, and I didn't perform anger. I wasn't fully feeling, because what I felt was more complicated than anger. What I told them both, clearly and without cruelty, was that the story I'd been living with about that period of my life had caused me specific harm over specific years, and that the information they'd had would have changed it, not fixed everything, not erased the pain of the relationship ending, but changed the story in a way that would have changed the work I did around it and the conclusions I'd drawn about myself from it. That's what the silence had cost. Not the betrayal by Joel. That was his, contained and old. But the particular shape of 8 years of self-examination built on an incomplete picture. Both friendships survived those conversations. I'm not entirely sure why, except that the honesty in the conversations themselves was real, and the accountability was genuine, and sometimes that's enough. I have a different relationship with both of them now. Not worse, exactly, but more clear-eyed. I know something about them I didn't know before, which is that in a moment of someone else's discomfort, they chose the path that cost them less. That's human. It's also true. The anxiety in relationships I spent years working on is something I've gone back to with my therapist and looked at again with the new information. It hasn't dissolved. Some of it is real, built from real things. But the part of it that was built on the wrong story has shifted, which is a strange and belated form of relief. Like a room in your own interior that you've been navigating around a piece of furniture that turned out to be smaller than you thought. The room is the same, there's just a little more space in it now. That story is over. The detail that lands with the most weight is that she processed the end of that relationship with people who knew. Actual conversations where she offered her own theories about what had gone wrong. And they listened and responded and stayed silent about the one fact that changed everything. That's not a passive omission. That's an active choice made repeatedly in the presence of someone who was working to understand something they'd been given incomplete materials to understand with. The specific harm named here is precise and important. It's not just that the relationship ended badly, it's that the story told in the aftermath shaped years of self-examination, and that story was constructed from information that had been editorially managed by the people around her, without her knowledge or consent. The shift in the therapy room at the end, the piece of furniture that turned out to be smaller, is the most quietly hopeful image in the whole story. Sometimes understanding the true shape of an old wound doesn't heal it, but it does change the size of what you're navigating around. And that's its own form of progress. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the person they'd trusted to be their advocate in the most vulnerable period of their life had been serving a different interest entirely. I was diagnosed with a serious but treatable illness at 31. I'm not going to specify what it was because it's not the center of the story, and some of it still feels private. But it was the kind of diagnosis that reorganizes your life immediately. The kind where you go into a doctor's office on a Tuesday, thinking you're there for a routine thing, and you come out 2 hours later, a different category of person than you were when you walked in. It required significant treatment over 14 months. And those 14 months were the hardest of my life in terms of sheer sustained difficulty. My boyfriend at the time was a man named Kieran. We'd been together for 2 years when the diagnosis came. He stayed. I want to be clear about that because it's relevant. He stayed when he could have left, which is not nothing. And I was grateful for it, with a depth that probably affected how I processed everything that came afterward. Kieran became, during the treatment period, my primary advocate in situations where I needed someone to speak on my behalf or help me navigate complex information when I wasn't at full capacity. Medical appointments, insurance conversations, the logistics of rearranging a life around a treatment schedule. He was present and capable, and I trusted him with things I would not have trusted anyone with, because I had no choice but to trust someone, and he was the person who had stayed. What I found out 14 months after completing treatment, when I was recovered and solid and had largely rebuilt my life, was that Kieran had been using the period of my illness to establish a relationship with a woman he'd met through work. I found out in the direct way, which is that Kieran told me. He did not tell me because he decided honesty was right. He told me because she had given him an ultimatum about his living situation. They had apparently been serious for long enough that she wanted the question of us resolved. And Kieran had decided that telling me was less costly than losing her. I sat with what he told me, and I asked him some specific questions. I wanted to understand the timeline. He was honest about it in that particular way, that people are honest when they've already made the decision that the truth serves them now. Fully, specifically, without the gaps he would have maintained if honesty had remained optional. The relationship with the woman, whose name was Petra, had started approximately 4 months into my treatment. She knew I existed and knew I was ill and had continued anyway, which is her moral accounting to do and not mine. Kieran had maintained both situations for 10 months, the final 10 months of my treatment and 4 months after its completion. I'm going to tell you the specific thing that made this different from a painful but ordinary betrayal. During the period when Kieran was beginning and maintaining his relationship with Petra, he was also the person managing significant parts of my medical situation. He attended appointments with me. He spoke to my doctors when I wasn't able to. He handled insurance disputes on my behalf. He knew details of my physical condition and my prognosis and my fears about both that I had not shared with anyone else because sharing them had required a specific trust, and he was the specific person I trusted. He had been carrying that knowledge while also carrying the other thing. He had held my most private fears about my own body and my own future while privately making decisions about his own future that did not include me. I had been most vulnerable to him at the exact period when he was most divided. I did not have a long conversation with Kieran about it. I found that I didn't want one. What he'd done had a clarity that more conversation wouldn't have improved, and what I'd done by trusting him with what I'd trusted him with had a clarity too. I had done it because the situation required it, because I had no other option, because he was there. I had not been naive. I had been sick. Those are different things, and I was not going to spend energy treating them as the same. I asked him to be gone from the apartment within the week. He was. He attempted several conversations in the days between, and I declined each one without anger. The week came and went, and he left. I want to say something about recovery that feels important. I had already recovered from the illness by the time I found out about Kieran, which meant that I did not have to process the betrayal while also being sick, which I consider a piece of luck I genuinely count. I had my physical capacity back. I had my life reorganized and solid. The emotional processing was hard, but it was not hard in the context of also managing a body that was fighting something, and that distinction mattered more than I can fully express. What I have not been able to fully resolve is the specific quality of what he had access to during those 10 months. The details of my medical situation, the fear I had in certain appointments about certain results, the conversations I had with him late at night when I was frightened in the way you are, when your body is doing something you can't control, and you need to say the fear out loud to someone who knows the full picture. I said those things to a person who was already, at the time, somewhere else in a way I didn't know. There's something about that I'm still working around. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way you work around things that don't have clean resolutions. I am healthy. That's the main thing, and I hold it as the main thing. And everything else is secondary to it, and I work to keep that hierarchy intact. That story is over. The sentence that does the most damage is the one about holding her most private fears, about her own body and her own future, while privately making decisions about his own future that didn't include her. That coexistence, the intimacy of what he was trusted with, and the distance of what he was already planning, is the specific cruelty of this one, and the narrator is precise about it without being melodramatic, which is the right register entirely. The distinction between naive and sick is the most important line in the story. She didn't fail at something. She was in a situation that required her to trust, and she trusted the person who was there. And the fact that he told her not because honesty compelled him, but because Petra's ultimatum made honesty convenient, is the final piece of the portrait. Even the disclosure was not about her. She was considered at each decision point and set aside. The recovery being already complete before she found out is the piece of luck she names correctly, and naming it correctly, not as something that makes the betrayal smaller, but as something that made it possible to process from a position of strength, is the kind of clear-eyed accounting that defines this entire story from beginning to end. Our next story comes from someone who had spent years believing that the end of their most significant relationship had been mutual and inevitable, and who discovered in the most ordinary possible moment that it had been neither. I dated a woman named Rose for 3 years in my late 20s, and when we ended things, I understood it as a gradual unraveling that neither of us had been able to stop. We talked about it in the way people talk about things they're calling natural, citing distance and different trajectories and the wear of years. And I'd accepted that framing because it felt honest enough, and because there was real truth in some of it, and because the alternative framing was more painful, and I wasn't sure I had the information to support it. We stayed friendly in the loose way that people do when they've been important to each other and are determined to prove they can be adults about it. Not close, just present at the same gatherings occasionally, capable of warm, 10-minute conversations that didn't cost either of us much. 5 years after the relationship ended, I was at a gathering where Rose was also present, and we ended up in a conversation that went longer and deeper than usual. We'd both had a couple of glasses of wine, and there was a genuine ease to it. The ease of people who knew each other well once and are far enough out from the difficult parts to access the good ones. At some point, in the natural flow of that kind of retrospective conversation, Rose said something that she delivered as a simple reflection, an honest thing, offered in good faith, assuming the ground was safe enough. She said she'd broken up with me because of something a mutual friend had told her. Something that had led her to believe I had been unfaithful. She said she'd spent a long time angry before eventually arriving at a kind of peace with it, and that distance and time had softened how she remembered things. I was quiet for a moment. Then I told her that I had not been unfaithful at any point. I told her I didn't know what she'd been told or who had told her, but it had not been true. She looked at me for a long moment. She believed me. I could see it happen, the shift in her face as the version of history she'd been living with reconfigured itself against the undeniable quality of what I was saying. She asked me what I thought had happened. I told her I genuinely had no idea, because I hadn't known there was a story I was supposed to be defending myself against. We stayed in that corner of the room for another hour, working backward through what we both remembered. The mutual friend in question was a man named Greg, who had been part of our shared social world, and who had, and at the time of the breakup, been someone we both considered a genuine friend. Rose had received something from Greg in the final month of our relationship. A message, she said, that had presented itself as delivered out of concern for her, that described something he claimed to have witnessed involving me. She had believed it because Greg had been her friend too, and she'd had no reason to doubt him. She had ended things without asking me directly, because the confrontation had felt impossible, and because she'd believed in the information. Greg had been in love with Rose. She had not known it at the time, though she said it was obvious in retrospect. I had not known it either, though I understood it immediately when she said it. He had done what people do when they want something and are not willing to obtain it honestly. He had tried to remove the obstacle that stood between him and it. The obstacle had been me. The information had been fabricated. The relationship it had ended had been real. Rose and I stayed in that corner until the party had nearly emptied. We did not become something again. 5 years is a long time, and we were both different people, and the window had closed in ways that had nothing to do with Greg. But we gave each other the conversation we should have had 5 years earlier, and that had value of its own kind, separate from what it could or couldn't restore. I found Greg on social media the next day. I did not message him. I looked at his life from a distance for approximately 10 minutes, and then I closed the window, and I have not opened it again. What I thought about in those 10 minutes was whether there was a version of what I wanted to do that would produce anything useful, and I concluded there wasn't. Greg had spent 5 years with his action and its consequence, and whatever that had cost him or not cost him was already done and mine to add to, or not. I chose not. I want to be honest that some of that was principle, and some of it was that I had already moved through the grief of that relationship once, and I didn't have any interest in re-entering it for his benefit or mine. What I'd lost had been real, and it had been taken from me, and those facts were now fully clear to me. And they existed in that clarity, regardless of whether Greg knew I knew. What I have is the conversation with Rose, the version of events that's actually true. The knowledge that what I'd experienced as an unraveling had in fact been a targeted removal, which is a different thing and changes how I understand myself in it. I wasn't someone who had failed to hold something together. I was someone who had something taken from them by someone they trusted, and the taking had been so clean that neither of the people being acted upon had known it was happening. That's a strange thing to discover 5 years late. It's also, on balance, better than not discovering it. That story is over. The specific quality of this betrayal is that it was surgical. One message, one trusted source, no opportunity for defense because there was no visible accusation to defend against. Greg understood exactly what he was doing and exactly how to do it, so that the damage was done before anyone thought to question the tool that delivered it. The thing he didn't account for was time and wine, and two people being honest in a corner at a party 5 years later, which is such a specific and ordinary undoing for something so calculated. Rose believing it without asking directly is not a failure. She was given information by someone she trusted in a form that didn't leave obvious room for challenge, and she responded as most people would. The narrator choosing not to message Greg is the right call named correctly. There is no version of that confrontation that returns the 3 years, and the clarity itself is the thing that has value, not the exposure of it to the person who caused it. Sometimes the justice isn't delivered to the person who deserves to receive it. Sometimes it just lives into the truth, finally being known by the people it most matters to. And sometimes that has to be enough, and sometimes it genuinely is. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the person they'd built their most stable adult life alongside had been quietly maintaining a version of themselves that their partner had never been permitted to see, and that the people closest to them had known it and said nothing. My husband Owen and I were married for 6 years. We met at 28, dated for 2 years, married at 30, and built the kind of life that looks from the outside like exactly what it is. Stable, considered, two people who chose each other deliberately and maintained that choice with consistent effort. We had a house, a routine, shared friends, a genuine partnership in the logistical and emotional sense of the word. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the shape of what came later. I was not unhappy. I was in a marriage I believed in, with a person I believed I understood. Owen had a close group of friends from college, 4 men he'd known for over a decade, who gathered a few times a year and maintained a group chat that was active and warm, and from which Owen would occasionally share something funny with me. I liked these men when I met them. They were easy with Owen in the way that old friends are, the shorthand of people who'd known each other through formative years, and I took their warmth toward him as a kind of endorsement of who he was. The one I knew least well was a man named Parrish. He lived in a different city, came to gatherings less frequently, and had a slightly different energy from the others, more observational, less immediately warm. I'd always attributed this to personality rather than anything specific. Some people are slower to open up, and Parrish struck me as one of them. The gathering that changed everything was a weekend trip that Owen's friend group took annually. A few days somewhere, the 5 of them, no partners. I had never had any issue with this. I trusted Owen, and I understood the value of friendships that predated a marriage. He came back from that trip, as he always did, in a good mood, full of stories, and slightly more relaxed than he'd left. 3 weeks after that trip, I received a message from Parrish. It was long and carefully written, in the way of someone who had spent significant time deciding to send it. He said he'd spent the 3 weeks since the trip deciding whether to tell me something, and had concluded that he would rather be the person who told me than continue to be a person who knew and hadn't. He said he was sorry for what he was about to say, and he was sorry it was coming from him rather than from Owen. He told me that Owen had maintained a significant and ongoing relationship with a woman from his past for most of her marriage. Not a secret from his friends. They had known, at various levels of detail, for years. What they had not done was tell me. Parrish said the dynamic of the friend group had made it feel like something that wasn't his to expose. That telling me would have meant going against Owen in a way that felt like a violation of the group's internal loyalty. He said he'd held that line for years, and that something about seeing Owen at the most recent gathering, the ease of it, the way things were discussed without apparent discomfort, had made him unable to hold it any further. He said he was telling me because I was a real person who deserved to make real decisions about my own life based on accurate information. He said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. I sat with his message for a full day. Then I read it again. Then I called Owen into the room where I was sitting, and I read it to him out loud, without any preamble. The conversation that followed lasted most of the night. Owen did not deny it. He confirmed what Parrish had said and expanded on it. The relationship had started approximately 2 years into our marriage, and had continued with varying degrees of intensity through the following 4 years, which accounted for most of the marriage. He said it had never been his intention to let it go on as long as it had. He said that sentence as though it contained an explanation, and I asked him to notice that it didn't. He tried several more formulations, and I asked him to notice that those didn't either. What I kept returning to, and I told him this directly, was not the relationship itself, as devastating as that was, but the 4 other men were other. 4 people who had sat across tables from me at gatherings and eaten food in my house, and accepted my warmth, and maintained a secret that was directly about my life and my choices and my future. 4 people who had watched me participate in a marriage they knew was not what I believed it was, and said nothing. One of them had said something, finally, after years, and he had done it in writing from a different city, in a careful message that had cost him something. The other 3 had chosen themselves each time. Owen moved out over the following 2 weeks. The divorce was not contested. He was cooperative and appropriately ashamed, and I want to say that the shame seemed genuine. Not performed, not strategic, but the real thing, which I noticed without being moved by it. A genuine shame about something you did for 4 years is not a transaction. It is just the appropriate response to who you were. I have spoken to Parrish once since then. A short call, a few months after everything settled. I thanked him for the message, and he said he wished he'd sent it years earlier. And I said I wished he had too, but that I understood why he hadn't even, as I couldn't fully forgive it. We were honest with each other, and I think we both felt the strange, particular something of 2 people who have been connected by an event neither of them wanted. I don't know if we'll speak again. I don't know if I want us to. But I am glad he exists in the way I'm glad anyone exists, who finally, at cost to themselves, tells the truth. The other 3 I have not spoken to and don't intend to, and their silence is information about them that I now have. I don't need to do anything with it. I just carry it as what it is. The knowledge of what people choose when choosing costs them something. Most people, given the option, choose themselves. Parrish chose differently. Late, imperfectly, and it mattered. That's worth knowing. That story is over. Parrish sending that message is the moral hinge of everything. Not because it undoes the harm, which it can't, but because it refuses to let the harm continue, undisturbed by the truth any longer. The framing he uses is exactly right. He would rather be the person who told her than continue to be a person who knew and hadn't. That distinction between what you choose to be versus what inaction makes you is the most important sentence in the story. The four men who said nothing are not villains in the theatrical sense. They made the ordinary human choice to protect their own comfort and their existing loyalties at someone else's expense, which is the thing most people do most of the time, and which is also a choice that has a real cost to someone real. Owen's genuine shame being noticed without being accepted as a transaction is exactly the right way to hold that. She sees it. She names it accurately. She does not let it function as a bargaining chip. Sometimes the only clean thing that comes out of a long betrayal is one person, late and imperfect, and genuinely sorry, finally deciding to be the one who tells the truth. Sometimes that's what you hold on to, not because it's enough, because it's what there is. Well, our final story for tonight comes from someone who spent years carrying the weight of a loss they'd misattributed, and who found in the process of letting something go that they'd been carrying someone else's dishonesty, along with their own grief, the whole time. My mother passed away when I was 29. She'd been ill for 18 months, and the end was not a surprise. But it was still the thing that reorganizes everything. The event that divides your life into before and after, in a way you understand, intellectually beforehand, and only truly know afterward. She was my closest relationship. The loss of her was the largest thing I'd experienced, and I moved through the grief of it slowly and seriously and over years. My partner at the time was a woman named Iris. We'd been together for 3 years when my mother got sick, and Iris was present and supportive through the illness in a way that mattered to me enormously. She understood instinctively what I needed, and when I needed it and when I needed her, to simply be there without making it about anything other than being there. I was grateful to her in a way that went very deep. We ended the relationship about 14 months after my mother died. The ending was Iris's initiation. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking and felt that we had been so shaped by the years of illness and grief that she wasn't certain who we were outside of that context. She said she needed to find out. She was honest and kind about it, and the conversation was painful in the way that honest endings are, and I moved through it with the particular exhaustion of someone who has already been moving through a great deal. After Iris left, I did the natural inventory that you do. I looked back over the relationship for signs I hadn't read correctly, for places I'd been absent or insufficient, for explanations of the ending that gave me something to learn. I found things, as you always do. I had been absorbed in grief in ways that had made me less present. I had relied on Iris heavily during the illness period. There were legitimate things I could examine and adjust. I incorporated those things into my understanding of who I'd been in that relationship, and I carried them forward as information about myself. What I found out 2 years after the relationship ended was that there was someone else. There had been someone else during the final 4 months with Iris. The same 4 months that had followed most closely on my mother's death, when I had been at my most absorbed and least present and most reliant. I found out through an entirely accidental overlap of social circles at an event where the person Iris had been involved with was present, and someone mentioned their history with Iris casually, and the timeline was legible to me immediately in the way that timelines become legible once you know to look at them. I did not reach out to Iris. I sat with what I'd learned for a long time, and I thought about the inventory I'd done after the ending, the things I'd identified as my insufficiencies, the weight I'd placed on my grief absorption as a contributing cause of the relationship failing. Those things were still real. I'd been genuinely absorbed, genuinely reliant, genuinely less present. None of that had been fabricated, but I'd been doing that inventory. in a picture frame that was missing a significant piece, and the missing piece changed the weight I assigned to the pieces I had. The grief of my mother's death was mine, and I owned it, and I had processed it honestly. But I had also, without knowing it, been processing the end of a relationship through a frame that had been constructed to leave certain things out. And some of the accountability I'd taken on in that frame had been taken on in a version of events that wasn't fully accurate. Not all of it. Some of it was legitimate and I kept it. But some of the weight I'd carried as my own was weight that belonged somewhere else. And I'd been carrying it for 2 years without knowing it wasn't mine. I wrote a letter to my mother that I didn't send anywhere because there is nowhere to send it. I told her about Iris and what I'd found out and what I'd understood from finding it out. I told her that I was okay and that the grief of losing her was the most real thing I'd ever moved through, and that I was glad she didn't know it was happening. I told her I was setting down the part of the weight that wasn't mine. Then I put the letter in a drawer and I left it there, and I have not opened it since. I am 35 now. I have a life that is full in the ways that count. The loss of my mother remains the organizing fact of my emotional landscape in the way that I understand it will for the rest of my life. And most days, I find that I can carry it without being bowed by it, which is what recovery looks like, and what I was told to expect, and what I have arrived at on the timeline that was mine. I have not spoken to Iris since the relationship ended. I don't intend to begin. What she did in those final months sits with everything else she was. The genuine care, the real presence, the instinctive understanding of what I needed. And I hold all of it together without resolving it into a clean verdict. Because it doesn't resolve cleanly, and insisting on a clean verdict would require me to discard too much that was real. People contain all of it, the care and the betrayal, the presence and the absence, the thing they gave you and the thing they took. Most of the time, that's what you're left holding. And the work is learning to hold all of it without collapsing the complexity into something simpler than it was. That story is over. The letter written to a mother who isn't there to receive it is the image that stays, not dramatic, not performed, just someone finding the form that fits the thing they needed to say and saying it into the only available space. The inventory taken after the relationship ended, the legitimate accountability carried for 2 years, the discovery that some of that weight wasn't hers. That's the specific harm of a departure that leaves the wrong story behind it. She didn't fabricate her own insufficiencies. They were real, but they were weighted in a frame that had been curated to omit the piece that would have redistributed the weight more accurately. And she'd been doing the work of a story that was missing a chapter. The closing observation that people contain all of it and the work is learning to hold the complexity without collapsing it is the truest thing you can say about this entire night's worth of stories. Every person we heard about tonight contained both. The ones who betrayed and the ones who were betrayed. The ones who stayed silent and the one who finally spoke. Every story had a person in it who was more than the worst thing they did. And every story had someone who deserved better than they got. And those two things coexist in each one without canceling each other out. And that's what I keep coming back to with all of these stories. The people who share them aren't looking for permission to write someone off entirely. They're looking for what anyone looks like when they're trying to hold something complicated honestly. When they're doing the work of understanding a betrayal without letting the betrayal become the only true thing about the time it occupied. That's hard. It takes the kind of patience that doesn't get recognized because it doesn't produce a scene or a confrontation or a satisfying public reckoning. It just produces a person who knows what happened and carries it clearly and keeps going. That's every person we heard from tonight. They kept going. Most days that's the whole story. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you being here. These are the kind of stories that stay with you a little, and I think they're supposed to. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because I'll keep finding the ones